Silas Crowley didn't knock. He never did. He shoved Clara Whitmore's gate open with the flat of his boot, walked straight past her fence like he already owned it, and dropped a folded paper on her porch railing without looking at her once. "Sign it today," he said. "Tomorrow I drop the number by half." Clara picked up the paper. Her hands were dirty from the morning's work. The number on the page was an insult dressed up as generosity. "You're offering me $400 for 160 acres. He finally looked at her then, the way a man looks at something he's already decided doesn't matter. "That's more than it's worth, sweetheart." That's. If you've ever watched someone underestimate a woman and then live to regret every word, stay with me. Hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from right now. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. You will not want to miss what happens next. The deed arrived on a Tuesday, folded inside a plain brown envelope with no return address, tucked between a feed catalog and an overdue water bill. Clara Whitmore almost missed it. She had been awake since before 4 in the morning, the way she always was those days. Not from habit, but from the kind of low, grinding worry that doesn't let a person sleep past the first gray light. She stood at the kitchen table in her work boots and a flannel shirt that used to belong to someone else, and she read the document 3 times before the words stopped sliding around on the page. 160 acres, Boneyard Valley, transferred by estate of Harold Eugene Whitmore, deceased, her uncle. A man she had met exactly twice in her life, both times when she was a child young enough that the memories had blurred down to impressions. A rough hand patting her head, the smell of tobacco, a voice that laughed too loud. He had lived alone out here on the edge of nowhere for 40 years and died the same way. Alone, in a county she hadn't visited since she was 8 years old. She set the deed back on the table and stared at it for a long time. Then she packed a single bag, locked the door of the rented room she could no longer afford anyway, and drove west. The land did not look like an inheritance. It looked like an argument. The valley road was barely a road. 2-tire tracks through cracked clay, lined on both sides by scrub brush and dry rock. The creek that showed on the county map had pulled back to a thin brown ribbon that barely moved. The fence posts leaned at angles that suggested years of not being touched. The barn roof had buckled on one side and the front gate hung from a single hinge. Clara sat in her truck at the top of the rise and looked at all of it for a while without getting out. She was not sentimental. She had not driven 4 hours expecting something beautiful. But there's a difference between expecting something hard and actually seeing it laid out in front of you, and she felt that difference settle into her chest like a stone dropping into still water. She got out of the truck. The first thing she heard was the cattle. Not mooing, not the deep, lazy sound she associated with large, healthy animals on good pasture. This was something more like a conversation, a low series of grunts and shuffles coming from behind the barn. She followed the sound around the far side of the building and stopped. 9 of them, standing in the shade of a dried-out oak, watching her with eyes that held more intelligence than she expected. They were small, smaller than any beef cattle she had seen, with rough, shaggy coats that looked like they'd been put together from leftover material. Their legs were longer than typical, their heads broader, and along their spines ran a ridge of slightly raised fur that made them look, in a certain light, almost prehistoric. Clara looked at them. They looked at her. "All right," she said to nobody in particular. She spent the first night in a sleeping bag on the floor of the farmhouse because the only bed frame had collapsed, and she hadn't thought to bring a cot. The electricity had been cut off. She found that out at dark when she flipped the switch, and nothing happened. She ate cold beans from a can and listened to the wind move through the gaps in the siding and told herself it was temporary. She was not entirely sure she believed that. In the morning, she drove into the nearest town, which was a place called Harlan's Crossing. Population somewhere around 800 if you counted generously, with a grain elevator, a hardware store, 2 churches, a diner, and a livestock auction barn that seemed to be the center of most activity. She went to the diner first because she needed coffee, and because she needed to hear voices that weren't her own. The place was about half full, mostly men in work shirts and caps, the kind of early morning crowd that ran on black coffee and short sentences. She took a seat at the counter and ordered a cup of coffee and scrambled eggs. The woman behind the counter, mid-50s, efficient, wearing a name tag that said Ruth, brought the coffee first and studied Clara with the frank, unhurried assessment of someone who notices strangers because there aren't very many of them. "You're not from here," Ruth said. It wasn't a question. "Just got in last night," Clara said. "I inherited a piece of land out in Boneyard Valley. Harold Whitmore was my uncle." Ruth's expression shifted. Not to pity exactly, but something adjacent to it. "Harold's place," she said, and seemed to stop herself from continuing whatever came next. "You can say it," Clara said. Ruth put both hands flat on the counter. "Honey, that land has been drying up for 15 years. Harold was a good man, but he stopped fighting it a long time ago. Most people around here figure the only thing left out there worth anything is the mineral survey, and even that's contested." "What about the cattle?" Clara said. "He left 9 of them." The diner got quieter. Not dramatically. Not the way it happens in movies where everyone turns at once, but Clara felt it, the slight shift in the room's attention. The way a couple of men at the nearest table stopped their conversation mid-sentence. One of them turned around. He was big, ruddy-faced, with the air of a man who had never once in his life questioned whether he belonged wherever he happened to be sitting. "Those Ridgebacks?" he said. Clara looked at him. "I'm Thomas Gable," he said. "I run the Gable Ranch, 12 miles north." He said it the way people state things they expect to impress. Then he leaned back in his chair and laughed, not meanly, but dismissively, the way you laugh at something you've already decided isn't serious. "You inherited Harold's freak show, 9 little mountain goats dressed up like cattle." A couple of men nearby chuckled. Clara picked up her coffee cup. "They looked healthy to me." "They look healthy because they eat anything that doesn't move fast enough," Thomas said. "Thorns, rocks, dead brush. You can't sell them for beef. They're too small and the meat's too lean. You can't breed them up to anything useful because nobody wants the bloodline. Harold kept them because Harold was stubborn, and Harold died broke, so—" He shrugged with his whole body, that particular shrug of a man who considers the matter settled. Clara ate her eggs and said nothing more. She was already thinking about the ridge of fur along those cattle's spines. She had been on the land 4 days when Silas Crowley showed up the second time. The first visit had been the one with the paper gun, the $400 offer, the boot against her gate, the word sweetheart delivered with the particular venom of a man who has learned that condescension is more efficient than argument. The second visit was more polished. He came in a good truck, newer than anything else she'd seen on the valley roads, and he came in the late afternoon when the light was still decent, and he brought a man with him, younger, carrying a clipboard, who introduced himself as a land assessor without making eye contact. Silas was not a large man. He was probably 60, trim, with gray hair clipped close, and a quality of stillness about him that Clara associated with people who were accustomed to getting what they wanted because they'd learned patience was more effective than force. He wore a clean shirt. He smiled at her like she was a problem he was looking forward to solving. "I want to be fair with you, Miss Whitmore," he said, standing at the edge of her porch, hands in his jacket pockets. "I'm raising the offer, 600. "For what?" she said. "Land, animals, equipment, whatever Harold left." "Equipment is mostly broken," Clara said. "I know. That's accounted for." She studied him for a moment. "Why do you want it?" "I consolidate land in this valley," he said. "That's my business. I'm not trying to take advantage. I'm offering you fair value for something most people would consider a burden." "Most people," Clara said. "What do you consider it?" Something moved behind his eyes. Not emotion exactly, more like calculation. "A long-term project," he said smoothly, "one I have the resources to manage." "Tell me something," Clara said. "You've been operating in this valley for how long?" 18 years. "And in 18 years, did you ever make an offer to my uncle?" A pause, short but real. "Harold wasn't interested in selling." "Seems to run in the family," Clara said. She spent the next 2 weeks learning the land the way you learn a difficult person, not by deciding you understand them, but by watching. She walked every acre she could reach, which was not all of them, because parts of the valley were rough enough that she turned back twice with a sprained ankle from the second time. She found the old spring on day 9. It was almost completely silted over, barely seeping, marked only by a slightly different color of rock and a few stubborn plants that shouldn't have been surviving where they were. She knelt next to it for a long time with her hands in the wet dirt. She found the cattle remarkable. She couldn't help it. Every morning she watched them work their way across the landscape with a kind of methodical confidence, eating things that nothing else would touch, moving to shade with precision timing, drinking from what little water existed in a way that seemed almost conservative. Small amounts, frequently, nothing wasted. One afternoon, she left a bucket of the good grass hay she'd bought in town. They looked at it, then looked at her, then went back to eating thorny scrub. "Fine," she told them. "Have it your way." She wasn't sure when she started talking to them. It happened the way most things happen when you're alone. Gradually, and then all at once. "All right." The boy appeared on a Wednesday. She was at the fence line doing repairs, pulling old wire, setting it taut again, learning as she went because she'd never done it before. When she became aware of someone watching her, she turned, and there he was on the other side of the fence, probably 11 or 12 years old, skinny, wearing boots 2 sizes too big. "You're doing it backwards," he said. Clara looked at the wire in her hands. "Am I?" "The twist has to go the other direction. Otherwise it'll pull loose first cold snap." She looked at him for a moment. "You want to show me?" He came through the fence with the ease of someone who had been doing it his whole life and took the wire from her without ceremony. His name, she learned over the next hour, was Elliot Hayes. His family ran a small spread 3 miles east, more chickens than cattle, struggling the same as everyone. He was matter-of-fact about it in the way that kids who grow up around money problems often are. Not self-pitying, just accurate. "My dad says your cattle aren't worth anything," Elliot said, twisting the wire with quick, practiced movements. "Your dad might be right," Clara said. Elliot glanced at the ridgebacks, who were working their way along the fence line about 50 yards away. "I don't think so," he said. "I saw them last winter during the freeze. Everything else was standing in the mud looking miserable. Those ones were just walking around like nothing was happening." Clara looked at the animals. "You noticed that." "Hard not to," Elliot said. He handed her back the wire tool. "My grandpa used to talk about cattle like these. He called them the old breed, said they came up through the desert from somewhere south, hundreds of years ago." Clara sat down on the fence post and looked at the boy. "What else did your grandpa say?" But what Elliot told her over the following afternoons, because he came back every afternoon without being asked, was more coherent than she expected. His grandfather, a man named Martin Sorensen, who was still alive and living 20 miles up the valley in a house he refused to leave despite being 81 years old and nearly deaf, had spent his early life working alongside the last generation of ranchers who remembered the old breeds. Not the new imported bloodlines bred for quick weight gain and soft pasture. The older ones. The ones that had been on this land before the big commercial outfits moved in and decided the old ways were too slow. "He says the problem with modern cattle," Elliot said one afternoon, sitting on the fence while Clara worked, "is that they're expensive to be alive. They need everything given to them. Water, good grass, medicine when the weather changes. Grandpa says that's not an animal anymore. That's a machine. And machines break when you run out of inputs." Clara looked up at him. "How old's your grandpa?" 81. But he's sharp. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." "Does he know about my cattle specifically?" Elliot hesitated. "He knew Harold. He might know something." Clara straightened up, pressed one hand to her lower back where the fencing work had left a persistent ache. "I'd like to meet him," she said. Martin Sorensen lived in a house full of paper, stacked on every surface, stored in boxes, tucked into the shelves that lined every room. Not garbage, but records. Handwritten ledgers, photographs, breeding charts, yellowed newspaper clippings, hand-drawn maps of land that no longer looked the way it did in the drawings. He was small and sun-darkened and moved carefully around his own house like a man who had learned to respect the creaking of his own joints. He studied Clara with sharp, interested eyes when Elliot introduced her. And then he said without preamble, "You've got ridgebacks." 9 of them, Clara said. Harold wouldn't sell them, Martin said, lowering himself into a chair by the window. Not to me, not to Crowley, not to anybody. And Crowley tried more than once, I'll tell you that. Clara sat across from him. Why did Crowley want them? Martin looked at her for a long moment. The afternoon light came through the window and fell across the stacks of paper on his desk. He didn't, Martin said. That's the thing. He didn't want the cattle. He wanted Harold to not have them. Because Crowley buys distressed land, Miss Whitmore. And a man with something that works on dry land is not a distressed man. Harold was the only thing in this valley that Crowley couldn't absorb. Those cattle were the reason. Clara sat with that for a moment. You're telling me the offer isn't about the land, she said. The offer is always about the land, Martin said. But what he was afraid of, what he's still afraid of, is that someone figures out what those animals are actually capable of. Because if they do, his whole business model starts to look a lot less inevitable. Clara looked at Elliot. Elliot looked at the floor. Outside, somewhere on the hillside, she could hear the low, settling sounds of 9 cattle who'd eaten thorns all day and were perfectly content. Tell me everything you know about this breed, Clara said. Martin Sorensen reached behind him and pulled a leather-bound ledger from the bottom of a stack. He set it on his knee and looked at her over the top of it. I was hoping someone would ask me that, he said, before I run out of time to answer. The window light shifted. The papers rustled in a breath of air through the old siding, and the old man began to talk. Martin Sorensen talked for 2 hours without stopping except to drink water, and once to find a specific page in the ledger that he insisted proved his point about pasture rotation in drought years. The light in the room went from afternoon gold to early evening gray while he talked, and Clara didn't move from her chair except to lean forward. What he told her was not a simple story. It was the kind of accumulated knowledge that doesn't come from books. It comes from watching the same land for decades, from conversations with people who are now dead, from failures that cost real money and real years and taught lessons that couldn't be unlearned. The Ridgeback breed, as Martin called them, had no official registry, no breed association, no certified bloodline documentation, no agricultural department classification. They existed in the margins of the livestock world the way certain plants exist in the margins of cultivated fields, not planted, not encouraged, surviving anyway. The commercial boys killed them off, Martin said, turning a page in the ledger to show Clara a hand-drawn diagram of cattle lineages she could barely follow. Not on purpose, not some conspiracy, just economics. When the government started subsidizing grain feed in the 50s, it got cheap to fatten cattle fast on corn. You could take an animal to market weight in half the time. The slow breeds, the ones that built their own muscle on rough terrain over 3 or 4 years, they just stopped being profitable by comparison. So people stopped breeding them, Clara said. Stopped breeding them, sold them off, let the bloodlines thin out. Martin tapped the ledger. Harold's grandfather got them from an old vaquero family down near the border. Paid almost nothing for them because nobody wanted them anymore. Kept them because he was contrary mostly. Harold kept them because Harold was his grandfather's grandson. Elliot, who had been sitting on a footstool near the door, said, "Is there anyone else who still has them?" Martin shook his head slowly. "Not that I know of. There was a woman in New Mexico who had a small group, but she sold her land about 8 years back, and I lost track of what happened to the animals." He looked at Clara directly. "What you have out there in that valley might be it, the last of a line that goes back further than anything registered with the state livestock board." The room was quiet for a moment. "And Crowley knows this," Clara said. It wasn't a question. Martin set the ledger down on his knee. "Crowley knows what everything is worth. That's his talent. He doesn't understand land or animals the way a rancher does, but he understands value. He's been watching Harold's herd for years, waiting for Harold to get old enough or broke enough to let go." He paused. "Harold got old, but he didn't get broke. And now here you are." Clara looked at the ledger in the old man's hands. "Can I borrow that?" Martin studied her face for a moment. Then he held it out. "Don't lose it," he said. "It's the only one." She read it over 4 nights, sitting at the kitchen table with a lamp she'd rigged from an extension cord run to the truck battery because she still hadn't gotten the electricity sorted. The handwriting changed across the decades. Different family members, different hands, some of it cramped and hard to read, some of it surprisingly clear. Numbers, mostly. Breeding records, weight gains, survival rates during hard winters and dry summers. Notes in the margins about specific animals. Old number 4 survived the 31 drought with no supplemental feed. 6 calves in 8 years, all healthy. And lower on the page, in a different hand, 4's line still the strongest. She found herself going back to those margin notes again and again. Not because they were dramatic, they weren't. They were plain, factual, the kind of notes a practical person writes for themselves, not for an audience. That plainness was exactly what made them convincing. The animals in those pages had not been coddled. They had been observed. She closed the ledger on the 4th night and sat in the dark kitchen for a while, listening to the valley. Somewhere out past the fence, the cattle were moving. She could hear the soft, irregular sound of their feet on dry ground, the occasional low exchange between animals settling for the night. She thought about what Martin had said. What you have out there might be it. She thought about Crowley and his clean truck and his patient smile. She went to bed, but didn't sleep much. In the morning, she drove to the county extension office in Harlan's Crossing, which was a single room attached to the back of the courthouse, staffed by a man named Dennis, who looked like he'd been sitting at that particular desk for approximately 30 years and had developed opinions about everything. She told him what she had: 9 ridgeback cattle, possibly the last of a line with no current registry. She wanted to know what the process was for documenting a heritage breed, whether there was a state or federal program, and what the land would need to look like to support expanding the herd. Dennis listened to all of this with an expression that suggested he was being polite. "Miss Whitmore," he said when she'd finished, "I've been in this office since 1987, and I have never once seen a rancher successfully petition for heritage breed recognition on fewer than 30 animals. I'm not starting with 30, I'm starting with 9. "That's my point," Dennis said. "What would I need?" He sighed and pulled a binder from his shelf. He was the kind of man who had binders for everything. Documentation of lineage, veterinary assessment of the animal's characteristics, evidence of distinct traits that differentiate the breed from existing registered breeds, a sponsoring organization willing to support the petition. He looked up at her. And time. This process takes years, not months. "Okay," Clara said. Dennis blinked. "Okay?" "I said okay. I'm starting. What's the first form?" He looked at her for a long moment, then pulled a different binder from the shelf. She drove back to the valley that afternoon with a folder of photocopied forms and a headache from fluorescent lighting and a distinct feeling that she had just committed to something much larger than a folder of paperwork. Elliot was waiting at the gate when she turned off the road. "My dad wants to talk to you," he said when she rolled down the window. The way he said it, carefully, trying to be neutral, told her most of what she needed to know about how that conversation was likely to go. "Where is he?" "Following me," Elliot said. And then, right on cue, a truck came down the road and pulled up behind her. Ray Hayes was a lean, tired-looking man in his mid-40s who had the face of someone who had been worried for so long it had settled into his features permanently. He got out of his truck and stood next to it, hat in hand, and nodded at Clara. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Ray Hayes. Elliot's been spending a lot of time over here." "He has," Clara said. "He's been helpful." "I'm sure he has." Ray turned the hat in his hands. "I wanted to ask you to keep him home. We've got enough work of our own, and I need him on our place." Clara looked at Elliot, who was staring at the fence post like it was deeply interesting. "Of course," Clara said. "Elliot, that sound right to you?" Elliot looked up. Something moved across his face. Not quite anger, not quite resignation. More like the particular expression of a kid who has already learned that what he wants and what happens are often different things. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Ray nodded once, put his hat back on, and got in his truck. He sat there for a second before rolling down his window. "I'm not trying to be unfriendly," he said to Clara. "It's just We're stretched pretty thin, and I don't want the boy getting attached to something that's not going to last. Clara held his eyes. I understand, she said. Ray drove back up the road. Elliot watched the truck go. He's not wrong about the stretched part, Elliot said quietly. I know, Clara said. He is wrong about the other part. Clara looked at the boy. He was still watching the road where his father's truck had disappeared. Go home, she said gently. Do what you need to do there. If there's time left after, you know where I am. He came back 3 days later on a Saturday morning without explaining why there was suddenly time, and Clara didn't ask. She just handed him a fence tool and pointed at the north pasture, and they worked until noon without talking much. That was, she was beginning to realize, one of the things she actually liked about Elliot Hayes. He didn't fill silence out of nervousness. He let it be what it was. Around noon, they sat on the tailgate of her truck and ate sandwiches she'd made that morning. Plain cheese and mustard, nothing impressive. And Elliot said, out of nowhere, The Hendersons lost 2 Herefords last week. Clara looked at him. How? Creek dried up completely on their east pasture. Animals couldn't get to the west water in time. He chewed his sandwich. Mr. Henderson's pretty sick about it. Those were his good breeding stock. Clara turned and looked at her own cattle, visible in the middle distance, moving at their unhurried pace across the dry hillside. They were drinking from the seep last night, she said. All 9 of them, one after another. Maybe 3, 4 gulps each. Then they moved on. Elliot watched them too. Like they know not to drain it. I think they do, Clara said. Elliot was quiet for a moment. Then, you really think they're going to make it? She thought about that honestly. She thought about the extension office forms and the binder and Dennis's expression. She thought about Crowley's truck and Martin's ledger. She thought about the seep she'd found on day 9, still barely moving under the clay. I think the question isn't whether they make it, she said. The question is whether I do. Elliot didn't say anything. He finished his sandwich and crumpled the paper wrapper in his fist. That was an honest answer, he said. It's the only kind I've got right now, Shab. The vet came on a Thursday in the 6th week. Her name was Dr. Anya Reeves. She drove a truck that was messier than Clara's, and she had been recommended by Martin Sorensen, which was good enough. She examined all 9 animals with the thoroughness of someone who genuinely wanted to know what she was looking at, not just confirm what she'd been told to expect. She spent 40 minutes on the oldest female alone, a broad, calm animal that Clara had started calling number 4 in honor of the margin note, taking measurements, examining her teeth, watching her move. When she was done, she leaned against the fence and wrote in her notebook for a while without speaking. Well, Clara said. They're in excellent condition, Dr. Reeves said, not looking up. Better than they should be, frankly, given what they have access to. Coat's rough, but skin underneath is healthy. Muscle mass is good. Hoof integrity is better than most beef cattle I see on good pasture. She paused. That one, she pointed her pen at number 4. She's pregnant. Clara went very still. How far along? My best guess, 8 to 10 weeks. It's hard to be precise. She's carrying small the way this breed seems to do, but the signs are clear. Dr. Reeves finally looked up. You might also want to check the 2 younger females. I think at least one of them may be as well. Clara looked at the animals, all 9 of them, and possibly more than 9 sometime in the next few months. This is important, Dr. Reeves said, and her tone shifted slightly, becoming more deliberate. What you have here is genuinely unusual. I've read about this type. I wouldn't have known what to call them before today, but I've seen references in old breed documentation. There may be veterinary and agricultural research value to these animals beyond any commercial consideration. I know, Claire said. I'm not sure you fully understand what I mean, Dr. Reeves said carefully. I mean that if word got around to the right people, university extension programs, heritage breed conservancies, these animals could attract significant attention. And to the wrong people? Clara said. Dr. Reeves looked at her steadily. To the wrong people, they become a commodity, something to be acquired and controlled. She paused. Who else knows what you have here? Clara thought about the diner, about Thomas Gable's dismissive laugh, about Martin Sorensen and his ledger, about Crowley's offer, always there, always waiting. More people than I'd like, she said. Crowley's third visit happened on a Friday afternoon, 12 days after Dr. Reeves's visit, and this time he brought someone different. Not a land assessor. A man in a sport coat who introduced himself as a buyer from a livestock operation out of Denver, gave a name, gave a card, mentioned figures in the range of cattle he dealt with daily that made Clara understand immediately why Crowley had brought him. They stood on her porch, and Crowley let the buyer do most of the talking, which Clara had already identified as one of his techniques. He liked to be the last word, not the first. The buyer, whose name was Carson, was friendly in the way that people who work on commission are friendly. Genuinely warm right up until they need something, and then you see the machinery underneath. What we're looking at, Carson said, is a one-time purchase, full herd acquisition. We'd handle transport, we'd handle all the paperwork with the state, and you'd walk away with enough to either buy better land or move somewhere that isn't... He paused, searching for the right word. Boneyard Valley, Clara provided. Well, he said, smiling. What's the number? Clara asked. Carson looked at Crowley. Crowley looked at Clara. 12,000, Crowley said, for the herd and the land both. Clara kept her face very still. 12,000 was not nothing. 12,000 was 3 years of the kind of work she'd been doing before she came here. She thought about the rented room, the overdue bills, the sleeping bag on the floor. She thought about number 4 carrying a calf. No, she said. Carson's smile shifted slightly. Miss Whitmore, I want to make sure you understand the market position here. These animals, and I say this respectfully, have no current commercial value in the registered beef market. What Silas is offering is based on potential, not present reality, and I understand the market position, Clara said. The answer is no. Carson looked at Crowley. Something passed between them that Clara couldn't read exactly but could feel. The slight recalibration of a plan that has hit an obstacle. Crowley took a step closer. Not threatening. He was too careful for that. Just closer, the way a person moves when they want to make a conversation feel more private. Clara, he said, and it was the first time he'd used her first name. I've been in this valley a long time. I've watched a lot of people come in with plans and leave without them. This land is hard. And it's going to get harder. There are weather predictions for this region that you should be paying attention to. What predictions? She said. He smiled, slow, patient. Dry years ahead, the kind that breaks ranches that are already marginal. He let that sit for a second. You're not marginal yet, but you're close. I'd rather make this offer now, when I can be generous, than come back in a year when I can't afford to be. Clara looked at him for a long moment. Are you warning me, she said, or threatening me? Crowley held up one hand, palm out. I'm giving you information. Okay, Clara said. Here's some information for you. Number 4 is pregnant. I think at least one other female is too. In 6 months, I won't have 9 animals. I'll have 11 or 12, maybe more. And the number you're offering today is going to look a lot smaller then. She opened her front door. I'll let you find your way back to the gate. Carson looked startled. Crowley did not look startled. He looked at her with that particular contained expression, the one she was beginning to recognize as the face he wore when he was revising his timeline. You're making this harder than it needs to be, he said quietly. Probably, Clara agreed. Take care, Mr. Crowley. She went inside and closed the door and stood in the dim hallway and breathed slowly until she heard the truck start and move down the road. Then she went to the kitchen and sat down, and her hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear. From the particular physical response her body gave to conflict, she'd had to hold very still through, and she recognized it and let it pass. She picked up Martin's ledger and opened it to the page with the margin note about old number 4. 6 calves in 8 years, all healthy. She set it back down. Tick. 3 weeks later, number 4 delivered a calf on a cold morning before dawn. Clara found them when she went out at first light. The mother standing calm, the calf already dry and upright and working its way around on uncertain legs with a determination that was almost funny. It was female. Clara stood at the fence in the early cold with both hands gripping the top rail and watched the calf figure out its legs. And something happened in her chest that she didn't have a precise word for. Not joy exactly, something more complicated. The particular feeling of watching something fragile be less fragile than you expected. She pulled out the small notebook she'd started keeping in her jacket pocket and wrote the date and the time and the calf's weight as best she could estimate it, and the notation: first calf, female, good color, strong on her feet by 6:15 a.m. She stood there until the sun came fully up and the valley went from gray to gold, and the cattle moved off to begin their morning grazing. 10 now. The word felt different when she thought it instead of 9. She went back to the house to start coffee and nearly tripped over her own step because she wasn't watching where she was going. She was looking back at the hillside, at the small moving shapes of the herd, counting them the way she did every morning. Force of habit, making sure. All 10 accounted for. She went inside. Come, she told Elliot that afternoon when he came by. On a Saturday, no explanation needed. And he broke into a grin that transformed his face so completely she almost laughed. A heifer? He said. Strong already. You should see her. He was over the fence before she finished the sentence, walking fast toward the pasture, and Clara followed at a less urgent pace. She watched him find the calf, who was by then dry and alert and deeply unimpressed by the attention, and crouched down to look at it at eye level, his hands on his knees, that same serious expression he brought to everything. She's got the ridge, he said. I know. That's... He stopped, looked up at Clara. Grandpa's going to want to know about this. Already planning to tell him, Clara said. I want him to see her. I want him to look at her and tell me whatever he knows about what she should become. Elliot looked back at the calf. He's going to cry, he said, matter-of-factly. He cries at things like this. He doesn't think I notice, but I do. Clara watched the calf push against her mother's side. That's all right, she said. So might I. Elliot glanced at her with an expression that held something. Not surprise exactly. More like quiet reassessment, like he was updating his understanding of who she was. You're not what my dad said you were, he said. What did he say I was? Elliot turned back to the calf. Someone running from something. Clara thought about that. Maybe I was, she said. Doesn't mean that's all I am. The calf shook its head in a sudden irritable way and pressed harder against her mother, and both of them watched it, and the afternoon light came down through the dry oak branches and settled on the hillside, and somewhere in the brush line the rest of the herd moved and rustled and went about their business of surviving everything this land had to offer. 20 miles away, in a clean office above a hardware store in Harlan's Crossing, Silas Crowley sat at his desk and read the weather projections for the next 18 months, and felt the particular cold satisfaction of a man who believes he understands how things end. He was not wrong about the drought. He was wrong about everything else. The drought didn't announce itself. That was the thing nobody warned her about. She had always imagined disaster arriving with some kind of signal, some shift in the air, or a change in the quality of light that would give a person time to prepare. But the drought came the way most hard things come, which is gradually and then completely. And by the time Clara understood what she was looking at, it had already been happening for months. The first sign was the seep. She went out one morning in early spring and found it reduced to a dark stain on the rock face, barely weeping, where 2 months before it had been running enough to fill a bucket in 20 minutes. She stood there looking at it for a long time before she went back to the house and checked the record she'd been keeping. Rainfall notations, water levels, the crude measurements she'd started taking with a stick marked at intervals after Martin had told her to track it. The numbers were not ambiguous. She drove into town that week and stopped at the hardware store for pipe fittings, and ended up standing in the aisle reading the label on a bag of drought-resistant grass seed for 10 minutes without moving, which was not something she would normally do. A man she didn't know came around the corner, saw her standing there, and said, "You too, huh?" She looked up. He was maybe 60, weathered, with the expression of someone doing math in his head that wasn't coming out right. "How bad is it out your way?" she asked. "Lost the East Creek 3 weeks ago," he said. "Supposed to be permanent water. Been there my whole life." He shook his head. "County Extension says we're in a moisture deficit going back 14 months. That's not a dry spell. That's a pattern." Clara put the seed back on the shelf. She didn't need grass seed. That wasn't the answer. She bought the pipe fittings and drove home. What she did next was the kind of thing that only makes sense in retrospect, or to someone who has been watching carefully enough to understand what they're seeing. She had been watching the ridgebacks for 7 months by then, long enough to stop projecting onto them, long enough to actually see them as they were, rather than as she hoped or feared they might be. She had noticed over the dry weeks that they had changed their patterns. Not dramatically. These were not animals that made dramatic gestures, but they were ranging further in the early morning, moving before the heat built, covering ground efficiently. They had stopped visiting the remains of the seep and started finding moisture from sources she couldn't identify easily. Certain plants, patches of soil that held a different quality of nothing that she could distinguish from the surrounding nothing. She started following them. Not every morning, but often enough. She would be up before 4, in her jacket and boots, and she would move out quietly behind the herd and watch where they went and what they chose. She brought the small notebook. She drew rough maps in it. She marked locations. By the end of 3 weeks, she had found 2 underground seeps she hadn't known existed, and a low point in the terrain where water pooled briefly after any kind of moisture event and stayed accessible 2 or 3 days longer than it should have because of the particular clay composition of the soil underneath. She started digging the first cistern by hand and finished it with a borrowed backhoe that Elliot's father, Ray, had let her use for a weekend without comment and without apparent curiosity, which was the most generous thing he had done so far, and she noted it. The second calf came in late spring. Another female, smaller than the first, but the same ridge along the spine, the same wide, calm eyes. Claire wrote it in the notebook. 11 animals. She also wrote, in the same entry, ranchers in the valley running supplemental feed 6 weeks earlier than last year. Henderson sold 8 head last week. Couldn't maintain water access. Gable reportedly buying extra hay from out of state. Crowley's name keeps coming up at the feed store. Nobody says why specifically. She underlined the last sentence. Martin Sorensen had a bad month in May. His heart had been unreliable for years, and it chose spring to make itself known more insistently. And for 2 weeks he was under orders from his doctor in town to stay in bed, which he ignored with the comprehensive stubbornness of a man who considers himself the final authority on what his own body is allowed to do. Clara drove up to see him on a Wednesday and found him in his kitchen making coffee in his bathrobe, which she took as a positive sign. "Your grandson said you were in bed," she said. "Elliot talks too much," Martin said, though without any edge. He poured 2 cups and brought them to the table with only slightly less steadiness than usual. "Sit down." She sat. He sat across from her. "How are they?" he said. He always asked about the cattle first. She had stopped finding it amusing and started finding it comforting. 11 now, she said. "Both calves are healthy. The herd's adapting to the dry conditions better than I have, honestly. I'm the one who's struggling." "With what specifically?" Martin asked, and his tone made it clear he wanted specifics, not a summary. "Water management. I found 2 secondary seeps and built a cistern, but I don't know how long they'll carry us if the pattern continues. I'm also starting to get attention from people I don't want attention from." Martin wrapped both hands around his coffee mug. "Crowley. Among others. The Denver buyer came back without Crowley this time. Offered me $18,000, said it was a one-day number and he'd be back in the area only once more." Martin's eyes sharpened. $18,000 is a significant jump from 12. "I know." "What did you say?" "I said I'd think about it," Clara said. I needed time to figure out what the jump meant, why the number moved. Martin nodded slowly. "What did you decide?" "That Carson talked to someone who knows what this breed is. Not a rancher. Someone with a different kind of knowledge. A researcher, maybe, or someone in heritage breed circles. The number moved because the understanding of the value moved." She paused. "Someone educated him between visits." Martin set his mug down. "Or Crowley himself figured out what I told you about the breed history, and that raised his ceiling." Clara hadn't considered that angle, and she felt it land. That would mean Crowley has more information now than he did 3 months ago. Or he had it all along and he's been playing the low number to see if you'd take it before he had to reveal his real hand. Martin shrugged one shoulder. "He's patient, that man. Patient and thorough. He doesn't leave a lot of loose ends." Outside the kitchen window, the sky was the particular white-blue of drought weather. Not hot yet, but dry in a way you could feel in your sinuses. Clara looked at it for a second. "He came by the property last week," she said. "I wasn't home. He left a note. Said he was in the area and would appreciate a call back when I had time." Martin's expression didn't change. "Did you call?" "Not yet." "Don't," Martin said. He said it simply, without drama. Not until you have something he needs more than what he's offering. Right now he thinks you're isolated and the drought is going to drive your decision. He needs you to feel that pressure. The moment you call him, you're confirming that you do. Clara looked at her coffee. It had gone slightly cold while they talked. She drank it anyway. How long has he been operating this way? She said. Martin thought about it. I watched him buy out the Pearson family in 2004. They had 400 acres of good bottom land. He started low, waited through a bad hay year, came back with a slightly better number, waited again. By the time they sold, they were so ground down by the waiting that they took 40% less than the land was worth just to have it over with. He picked up his coffee. He counts on people getting tired before he does. He's never met anyone who doesn't get tired, Clara said. Martin looked at her steadily. No, he said. He hasn't. The summer turned brutal in the way that only high desert summers can. Not just hot, but relentlessly, personally hot. The kind that makes you understand why old peoples built their whole calendars around the movement of water. The creek that had been a thin ribbon in spring was gone by July. Completely gone. The bed was cracked clay and loose rock, and the willows that had managed to hang on through spring were going brown from the bottom up. Clara hauled water 3 times a week from a public trough 15 miles down the valley road, loading 50-gallon drums into the truck bed and driving back on roads that were getting worse as the heat continued. It was not efficient. It was not sustainable beyond a few months. She knew that. The Ridgebacks drank from the cistern she'd built and from sources she still couldn't fully identify. They ate things nothing else would eat. They did not look distressed. On the morning she followed them, they moved with the same measured confidence they had always shown, and sometimes she caught herself resenting them for it slightly, for their composure, their self-sufficiency, their absolute indifference to the crisis she was managing on their behalf. You're not making this easier, she told Number 4 one morning. Number 4 looked at her with the expression of an animal that has never once considered anyone else's emotional state and had no plans to start. Fair enough, Clara said. The valley began to crack in August. Not metaphorically, literally. The clay soil fractured in long lines that ran across pastures like the land was trying to pull apart at the seams, and everywhere you looked there was the beige-gray color of dried ground and dried plant matter, and animals standing in what shade they could find, looking like they were waiting for something that wasn't coming. The Henderson Ranch lost 3 more cattle. Clara heard about it at the feed store from a woman named Patricia, who worked the register and kept track of the valley's news the way some people track stock prices, constantly, automatically, because it was the information that mattered in her world. Henderson's down to 8 head now from 22, Patricia said, while Clara filled out the paperwork for a bulk seed order she wasn't sure she'd actually need but was buying for the documentation of intent. The Nguyen place to the south is considering listing, and Tom Gable, she lowered her voice slightly, though the store was nearly empty. Tom Gable bought cattle insurance last year that had a drought exclusion in the fine print, and he's just figuring that out now. Clara looked up from the paperwork. Who sold him that policy? Patricia gave her a look that said everything without saying anything. Crowley doesn't sell insurance, Clara said. No, Patricia said, but he introduced Tom to a man who does. About 18 months ago. Very helpful of him. Clara put her pen down on the counter. A drought exclusion in the fine print. 18 months ago. Right around the time she was now realizing that Crowley would have had access to the same long-range weather projections she'd heard about in the hardware store aisle in spring. The projections about 14 months of moisture deficit. The pattern. Patricia, Clara said quietly, how many ranchers in this valley carry insurance through the company Tom Gable uses? Patricia pretended to be busy with something behind the counter. I couldn't say. Could you guess? A pause, then. I'd say most of the ones who've had dealings with Silas Crowley in the last 2 years. Clara picked up her pen and finished the paperwork. Her hand was steady. Her mind was not. She drove to Martin's house that afternoon instead of home. He was up and dressed and looked better than he had in May. The color back in his face, moving without the careful deliberateness of someone monitoring each step. She told him about the insurance. All of it. She laid it out as clearly as she could, which wasn't entirely clear because she was still assembling it while she talked. Martin listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a while. "That's not illegal," he said finally. "I know. That's the genius of it. He sets the conditions, he waits for the conditions to arrive, and then he moves in when everyone is already broken. He's not causing the disaster. He's just positioned to profit from it before anyone else." Martin shook his head slowly. "The man is thorough." "I keep underestimating how thorough," Clara said. "Most people do. That's why it works." Martin looked at her. "What do you need?" "I need to understand what's going to happen in the next 60 days. Who's going to fold, in what order, and where that puts Crowley in terms of his position in this valley." Martin stood up and went to his desk, the one buried under paper, and started moving things around with surprising certainty, as if he knew where everything was despite the apparent chaos. "Sit down," he said. "We're going to make a list." The list, when they made it, was not encouraging. 11 ranching families in the valley were in serious trouble. Of those, 6 had some connection, direct or indirect, to Crowley's network of referrals and business relationships. 4 of the remaining 5 were operating on such thin margins that the first offer of cash for distressed land would likely be taken without a counter. The 11th was Ray Hayes, who had no connection to Crowley but whose ranch was also in the worst shape it had been in since Ray's father had run it, and who had a son who spent his free time at Clara's fence line. Clara looked at Ray's name on the list and didn't say anything for a moment. "He's not going to take help," she said. "No," Martin agreed. "He's the kind of man who'd rather lose it quietly than admit he needs something." "I know Ray," Martin said. "I've known him 20 years. He's got pride where most people have a sense of self-preservation." "That's not a criticism," Clara said, and she meant it. "No," Martin said. "It's not." The knock on Clara's door came on a Tuesday in the 3rd week of August at 7 in the morning, and she opened it expecting Elliot and found Thomas Gable instead. He looked terrible. That was the first thing, and she couldn't think past it for a second, because she had only ever seen Thomas Gable arranged in the full confidence of a man who believed things were going his way. And what was standing on her porch now was something else entirely. He was unshaved. His shirt was wrinkled in a way that suggested it might have been slept in. He was holding his hat in both hands in front of him, like something he needed to keep doing to stay upright. "Tom," she said. "Miss Whitmore." He looked at the hat. "I need to talk to you." She stepped back and let him in. She made coffee because it was something to do with her hands while she figured out what was happening. He sat at the kitchen table and she put a cup in front of him, and he wrapped his hands around it the same way Martin did, and she waited. "I heard you've still got water," he said. "Some," she said carefully, "and your cattle are—" "They're doing all right." "They are." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "I've lost 14 head since June. The insurance—" He stopped, started again. "The insurance claim was rejected. Drought exclusion. I didn't read the whole policy when I signed it." He looked up at her for the first time since he'd sat down, and the expression on his face was one she recognized as the particular pain of a proud person being forced to see themselves without the protection of their pride. "I know what I said about your cattle. In the diner. I know what I called them." "Tom," she said. "I was wrong," he said, and the 2 words came out with real effort, the way words do when they've been held back a long time, and finally just have to come out. "I was wrong, and I need to ask you something, and I'm asking it knowing how it sounds given everything." Clara put both hands flat on the table. "Ask." "I need a breeding pair. I need something that can survive what this land is doing right now. I've got family here. My wife's mother lives on the property. I've got—" He stopped again. Something moved across his face that was close to what Elliot had described about Martin. That vulnerability of a person who doesn't know how to be anything other than strong and is currently not that. "I've got people counting on me, and I am out of options." Clara looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the diner, Goat Girl, the easy laughter of men who had decided she didn't matter before she had finished her first cup of coffee. She thought about what Martin had said. He counts on people getting tired before he does. She thought about a different thing, too, about what it cost to be the person who held on to a grievance when someone was sitting across from you with their hat in their hands and their family's future on the table. "What can you pay?" she said. Thomas looked up. "Right now," she said. "Not what the animals are worth on a good year, not what the market might say in 3 years. What do you have right now?" He swallowed. $400. Maybe 5 if I sell the spare trailer. Clara looked at her coffee cup. She did the math that she'd been doing in her head since spring: herd size, breeding pairs, reproduction timeline, how many animals she could move before she compromised the core group. The number was tight. It was genuinely tight. 500, she said. 1 breeding pair. The male is young, but he's sound. The female hasn't calved yet, but she's healthy. She looked at him directly. "You take care of them the way I tell you to take care of them. You watch how they graze, what they eat, how they find water. You don't try to manage them the way you've managed your other cattle. You let them show you." Thomas nodded quickly, like a man who doesn't want to give anyone time to change their mind. "And Tom," she said, "you tell me everything you know about the insurance policies Crowley's people have been selling in this valley. Every name, every ranch, every detail you know." He looked at her sharply. "That's what this is about." "Part of it," she said. "Do we have a deal?" He set his hat on the table and reached across and shook her hand with both of his, which was not something she expected and which said something about where he was in that moment that no other gesture could have communicated as clearly. "Deal," he said. But Elliot found out from his father that same evening. Ray Hayes had heard from someone at the feed store, because nothing in Harlan's Crossing stayed private for long, and he showed up at Claire's fence the next morning earlier than usual, before she'd finished her first cup of coffee. "You sold Gable a pair," he said through the fence wire. "I did," she said. "Why?" Not accusatory, genuinely asking. Clara leaned against the fence post. "Because he came and asked, and because the deal I made with him gives me something I needed." Elliot climbed through the fence. "The insurance information." She looked at him. "You heard that. My dad was on the phone with Patricia from the feed store for 40 minutes last night. Sound carries in our house." He stood with his arms at his sides, looking at her with that serious, assessing look. "Crowley's going to find out you sold to Gable." "I know." "That's going to make him move faster." "Probably." Elliot was quiet for a second. Then, "Does that scare you?" Clara looked out across the valley. Dry and cracked and bleached pale by weeks of sun, the herd visible in the middle distance going about their morning routine with their characteristic lack of drama. "Yes," she said. It came out plainly, without apology. Elliot seemed to appreciate that. He nodded once. "Okay," he said. "What do we do today?" She handed him the fence tool she'd been holding. "North pasture," she said. "I want to extend the cistern runoff channel before the next heat wave, and I want to map where the cattle went yesterday morning. I think they found another water source, and I want to know where it is." Elliot took the tool. "You're going to follow them again. Tomorrow morning. You want to come?" He considered this with the seriousness he brought to everything. "My dad's going to ask where I'm going." "Tell him you're helping me map water sources," Clara said, "because that's what you're doing." Elliot almost smiled. He might actually be okay with that. "I know," Clara said. "I counted on it." They walked out toward the north pasture in the early morning heat, and the herd moved on the hillside above them, slow and deliberate and absolutely certain of themselves. And the valley lay cracked and pale all around them, and somewhere 20 miles away in his clean office above the hardware store, Silas Crowley had just heard from his contact at the feed store that Thomas Gable had a breeding pair of ridgeback cattle loaded into a trailer and heading north. He sat with that information for a while. Then he picked up the phone and started making calls. Crowley moved fast once he decided to move. That was something Clara had not fully accounted for. She had been watching his patients so closely that she had almost forgotten that patient men, when they finally act with everything they have been saving up. The flyers appeared in Harlan's Crossing on a Thursday morning. She saw them stapled to the bulletin board outside the post office, taped to the window of the diner, pinned up at the feed store next to the hand-lettered notices about lost dogs and hay for sale. Clean, professionally printed, the kind of thing that costs money to produce in a town where most notices are handwritten on index cards. Emergency livestock auction, Boneyard Valley region. Organized for the benefit of drought-affected ranching families. All proceeds to sellers. Professional assessment provided. One-day event. Date: September 14th. Location: Harlan's Crossing. Fairgrounds. At the bottom, in smaller text, facilitated by Crowley Land and Livestock Services. Clara stood in front of the feed store bulletin board and read it twice. A woman came out of the store behind her, saw what she was reading, and stopped. "You going to participate?" the woman asked. Her name was Deb. She ran the small ranch 2 valleys over, and she had the look of someone who had been sleeping badly for weeks. "No," Clara said. Deb looked at the flyer. "It might be the only way some of these families get anything out of their cattle before they have to give everything up." "I know," Clara said. "That's exactly what it's designed to look like." Deb studied her for a moment. "You think it's a trap?" Clara peeled the flyer off the board carefully, keeping it intact. "I think it's a very well-organized opportunity for one man to buy distressed animals at distressed prices while looking like he's doing everyone a favor." She folded the flyer and put it in her jacket pocket. "But that's just my view." She drove to Martin's house. Martin read the flyer with his reading glasses on, holding it at arm's length the way he did with anything that required close attention, and his expression went through several phases before settling on something that was partly admiration and partly deep irritation. "September 14th, he said. "That's 3 weeks away." "Yes. Enough time for word to spread through every struggling ranch in the valley. Enough time for people to feel like they have no other option." He set the flyer down on his desk. "And he's framing it as emergency relief. Clever. Anyone who criticizes it publicly looks like they're opposing help for desperate families." "That's the other thing it's designed to do," Clara said. "Anyone who pushes back becomes the villain." Martin took off his glasses and set them on top of the flyer. "What are you going to do?" Clara had been thinking about this since the feed store parking lot, the whole drive up the valley road, the whole walk to Martin's front door. "I need to talk to every ranching family in this valley before September 14th, she said. "Every one of them that's considering bringing animals to that auction. I need them to understand what they're walking into." Martin looked at her steadily. "Some of them already know Crowley. Some of them have done business with him and feel like it was fair." "I know that. And some of them are desperate enough that even a bad deal looks good right now." "I know that too," Claire said. "I'm not going to tell them what to do. I'm going to tell them what I know and let them decide." Martin was quiet for a moment. He picked up his glasses and put them back on, then took them off again, a habit she'd noticed he had when he was thinking something through. "You'll need help," he said. "You can't cover 11 families in 3 weeks alone and still manage your ranch." "I know. Elliot can help with some of it. The boy knows everyone." "I already thought of that," Clara said. Martin nodded slowly. Then he looked at her with the particular directness of someone who has run out of patience for circling around the important thing. "And what about your herd? If Crowley figures out what you're doing, he's going to come at you directly. He's going to do something to make your position harder." Clara thought about the cisterns, the water mapping, the breeding pairs she'd sold to Gable, which Crowley already knew about. "He's already doing that," she said. "He called the county assessor's office 2 weeks ago and requested a new land valuation on my property. I found out from Dennis at the extension office." Martin's eyes narrowed. "A new valuation means a potential property tax reassessment." "Exactly. If the valuation goes up significantly, my tax bill goes up. And if it goes up enough, fast enough, I'm in the same position as everyone else." She paused. "He's thorough." "You said that before," Martin said. "I keep discovering new reasons to mean it." She started with the Hendersons because they were the most straightforwardly in trouble, and because Bob Henderson was the kind of man who didn't require a long preamble. She drove out on a Friday morning and found him patching fence in the south pasture, which was a thing men did when they were too worried to sit still. He saw her coming and waited. "You saw the flyer," she said when she reached him. "Yesterday," Bob said. He kept working while he talked, which she didn't mind. "My wife thinks it might be the right move. Get something for the remaining 8 before we lose them to the heat." "What do you think?" Bob pulled a wire taut and twisted it. "I think the timing is convenient for someone who isn't me." "It is," Clara said. I want to show you something. She pulled out the notes she'd made at Martin's kitchen table. Names, dates, the pattern of Crowley's acquisitions over 18 years in the valley, the insurance connection, what Thomas Gable had told her about the policy language. She had written it all out clearly, not as an argument, but as a timeline, the way you lay out facts for someone who is capable of drawing their own conclusions. Bob read it without speaking. He read it again. He set it down on the top rail of the fence and looked out across his dry pasture. If I take my cattle to that auction, he said slowly, and Crowley buys them at whatever price he sets, you'll have the cash, Clara said. Yes, that part is real. But he'll have the animals. And when the drought breaks, he'll have a herd that can work this land, Clara said. And you won't. And then when you need to rebuild, you'll either have to buy from him at whatever price he decides, or you won't rebuild at all. Bob was quiet for a long time. A hawk went over, high and slow, reading the land below for anything worth eating. What's the alternative? He said. I can't keep them alive on what I've got. I know, Clara said. I've been thinking about that. Give me until the end of next week. He looked at her sideways. That's not an answer. It's the beginning of one, she said. Will you wait? He picked up his fence tool. Don't make me regret it, he said. She talked to 6 families in 8 days. It was exhausting in a way that physical work wasn't, because every conversation required a different approach. Some people needed the full documentation. Some needed only the one fact that unlocked their own doubts. Some needed to hear it from Martin rather than from her. And for 2 of those, she drove Martin out personally, which he submitted to without complaint, but with the energy consumption of a man who was spending reserves he didn't entirely have. Elliot handled 3 families on his own. She had given him the notes, walked him through the key points, and sent him off on his bicycle on a Saturday morning with the particular confidence of someone who has been watching a person for months and knows what they're capable of, even when that person is 12 years old and underestimated by almost everyone. He came back that afternoon with a notebook full of his own notes, additions to what she'd given him, details about 2 families she hadn't known, a water-sharing agreement that one family had with a neighbor that Crowley apparently didn't know existed, and a detail about the Nguyen family's land title that had a recorded easement that could complicate any future sale. She read his notes at the kitchen table while he sat across from her eating an apple. How did you get this much? She said. People talk to kids, he said. They don't think we're recording anything. Clara looked at him over the notes. You should have been uncomfortable asking some of this. I was, he said, but you needed it. She set the notebook down. Elliot. What? Thank you. He looked at the apple. Don't make it weird, he said. Ray Hayes came to her. That was the thing she hadn't expected, even after the fence tool and the borrowed backhoe. Ray coming to her property on his own, in the evening, knocking on her door with the same careful courtesy that Thomas Gable had brought, and the same eroded quality around his edges that the drought had given everyone. She opened the door, and he took his hat off. Ray, she said. I heard you've been talking to people about the auction, he said. I have. He nodded once. He stood there on the porch with the hat in his hands, and she could see him working through something internally, the same visible effort of a man not used to asking. Elliot thinks I should come to you, he said. I didn't ask him to say that. I know. He said it on his own. That's almost worse. A brief, involuntary, almost smile crossed his face. He's got opinions. He does, Clara said. Come in. She made coffee. He sat at the table and she put the cup in front of him, and he looked at it for a while before speaking. I'm not in the same situation as Gable or Henderson, he said. My cattle are down to 12 head, but they're surviving. Just barely, but they're alive. The problem is feed. I'm out of stored hay and I can't get more at a price I can afford. And the pasture is... There's nothing left in the pasture. Clara sat down across from him. What kind of cattle? Standard beef mix. Nothing special. Nothing like... He paused. Like yours. She watched him. My cattle can't do what yours do, he said. I understand that now. I've watched Elliot watch yours for months. I've listened to him at dinner talk about what he sees them eat, where they find water. I'm not a stupid man, Miss Whitmore. I was a skeptical one. That's different, It is different, she agreed. I don't need a breeding pair, he said. I can't afford one, and I don't have the land management skills yet to handle animals I don't understand. He looked at her directly. What I need is water access. My east water is gone. My well is down 40%. If I could run a line to one of your cisterns, just for the season, just until the drought breaks, I could keep my cattle alive and figure out the rest. Clara thought about the cisterns, the water mapping she and Elliot had done, the output calculations she'd made in the notebook. I've got one cistern that's running at about 60% capacity right now, she said. My herd uses maybe 30% of its output. The rest is overflow that I'm capturing but not fully using. Ray's expression shifted slightly. Not relief yet. More like the face of someone who has been braced for a door to close and it hasn't. What would you want for it? He said. Clara thought about this carefully. Nothing right now, she said. You run a line, you pay for the materials, and you run it back when the water table recovers. That's it. He looked at her. That's not a fair deal for you. It's the deal I'm offering, she said. Ray put both hands flat on the table, the way she had with Thomas Gable 2 weeks ago. Why? She thought about how to say it. Because Elliot told me you're the kind of man who keeps his word once he gives it, and because I might need people in this valley to know that what I'm doing out here is worth protecting. She paused. And because your son has been coming to my fence every chance he gets for 7 months, and I think he deserves to come home to a ranch that's still standing. Ray looked down at the table. When he looked back up, his jaw was set and his eyes were bright in a way he was clearly trying to manage, and he nodded once, sharp and certain. You'll have the materials receipts by Monday, he said. She was in the middle of running supply calculations on paper, the kind of long-form math that has to be done by hand because it requires you to catch your own wishful thinking. When Crowley's truck came down the road on a Tuesday afternoon and stopped in front of her gate, he didn't get out right away. He sat in the truck for a minute, which was new. She watched through the window and felt the particular quality of stillness that comes before something changes. When he got out, he came alone. No Carson, no assessor, nobody. Just Crowley in his clean shirt, coming up to the porch with his hands out of his pockets for once, which she noticed. She opened the door before he knocked. He stopped at the porch steps. I heard you've been talking to families in the valley about my auction. I have, she said. He was quiet for a moment, not angry, or not visibly, which with him was the same thing. What have you been telling them? The truth, she said. What I know, what I've documented. I'm not telling anyone what to do. You're telling them to stay away from an event that could give them real money during a crisis, he said. I'm telling them to understand what they're agreeing to, Clara said. Whether they go or not is their decision. Crowley looked at her for a moment. Then he did something she didn't expect. He sat down on her porch steps without being invited. Just lowered himself onto the second step and looked out at the valley, and for a second he looked like something other than the man she'd been tracking for months. You know, he said, I've been doing this for a long time. 18 years, she said, in this valley. He glanced at her. You've been doing your homework. I've had a good teacher. A pause. Martin Sorensen, he said. He knows this valley, Clara said. And he knows you. Crowley looked back out at the landscape. Martin's got a particular view of me. I understand that. He interlaced his fingers over one knee. But I want you to consider the possibility that not everything I do is predatory. These families need cash. The auction gives them cash. Yet, yes, I make money. That's how business works. You structured insurance policies with drought exclusions 2 years before the drought, Clara said, knowing what was coming. He didn't flinch. I can't control weather projections. You can control what you do with them. He turned and looked at her fully. What do you want, Miss Whitmore? Not in general. Right now. What's the outcome you're working toward? Clara had thought about how she would answer this if he ever asked it directly. She had rehearsed it mentally and decided that the rehearsed version sounded wrong and she would just say what she actually meant. I want the families in this valley to still be here after this drought, she said. All of them. Not absorbed into your holdings, not displaced. Here, with their land and something alive on it. Crowley studied her. That's idealistic. Maybe. Some of them can't be saved. The margins are too thin, the debt is too old. I'm not creating that situation. No, Clara said, but you're the one waiting at the bottom of it. He stood up from the step, brushed off his slacks, a small, precise gesture. He looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before. Not the calculation, not the patience. Something more honest than that, and she wasn't sure what to do with it. The auction is happening, he said. Whoever comes, comes. I'm not canceling it because you've been talking to people. I'm not asking you to, Clara said. Then what are you asking? She looked at him steadily. I'm not asking you for anything, she said. I'm just doing what I'm doing, same as you. He held her gaze for a beat longer than was comfortable. Then he nodded, a small, contained acknowledgement, and walked back to his truck. She stood on the porch and watched him drive away, and then stood there a while longer, looking at the valley. The day before the auction, Clara drove to each of the 6 families she'd spoken with and confirmed where they stood. 4 of them had decided not to go. Bob Henderson was still undecided. The Nguyen family, she discovered when she arrived, had already made their decision, not the one she'd hoped for. Linda Nguyen met her at the truck, arms crossed, expression that said the decision had been made and she wasn't interested in relitigating it. We're selling, Linda said. 4 head to Crowley, prearranged. The rest we're keeping. Clara looked at her. 4 head. We negotiated directly, not through the auction. He came out here 2 days ago and made an offer, and we took it. Linda's chin came up slightly. I know what you think, but those 4 animals are barely surviving, and what he offered buys us enough feed to keep the other 6 through winter. It's math, Clara, not betrayal. Clara breathed. You're right, she said. I'm sorry. Linda uncrossed her arms slightly. I'm not handing him the whole ranch. I know. 4 animals for a winter's feed supply. In this drought. That's not a terrible deal. No, Clara said. It's not. And she meant it. She was aware enough of her own certainty to know when it had been bumping up against someone else's reality without enough respect. Are you okay? Linda looked at her for a second, surprised by the shift. We're managing, she said. That's the best I can say right now. That's enough, Clara said. Passem. The auction happened without her. She heard about it in pieces over the following 2 days, from Patricia at the feed store, from Elliot, who had bicycled into town specifically to observe and report back, from Thomas Gable, who called her on the landline that evening. Gable's voice on the phone had a particular edge to it. 14 ranchers showed up, he said. Crowley bought 42 head across 11 sellers. Prices were not terrible, not good, but not the robbery I expected. He played it conservatively, Clara said. Why would he do that? Clara thought about Crowley sitting on her porch steps. The question he had asked, what are you working toward? Because he knows I have documentation, she said. And because he's smart enough to know that if he makes it obvious, it becomes a story that follows him. He took a smaller profit today to protect a bigger operation tomorrow. Gable was quiet for a moment. So he still wins. He got 42 animals, Clara said. He wanted the whole valley. That's a thin victory. Yes, Clara said. It is. 2 days after the auction, something happened that she hadn't planned and hadn't seen coming, which was becoming a pattern in her understanding of how things actually worked versus how she imagined they would. A truck she didn't recognize pulled up to her gate in the late morning. A university vehicle, state plates, a young woman in the driver's seat with a magnetic sign on the door that read College of Agricultural Sciences. The woman's name was Dr. Simone Park. She was in her early 30s, compact, with the energy of someone who was perpetually slightly behind where she wanted to be, and had learned to use that as motivation rather than frustration. She introduced herself as a researcher in heritage livestock conservation and said she had received a referral from the state extension office, specifically from a man named Dennis, which surprised Clara enough that she asked the question without meaning to. Dennis referred you? Dr. Park smiled. He wasn't enthusiastic about it, but he filed the initial documentation you submitted, and it crossed the desk of one of our department heads, and she gestured at the truck, at herself, at the road she'd driven down. Here I am. Clara stood at the gate and looked at her for a moment. Then she opened it. They spent 3 hours with the herd, 3 hours in which Dr. Park said very little and looked at a great deal, and occasionally crouched down to examine something at eye level with an intensity that the cattle regarded with total indifference, which Clara took as a mark in everyone's favor. When they finally sat on the tailgate at the end of the afternoon, Dr. Park opened her field notebook and looked at what she'd written. "I want to be careful about what I tell you," she said, "because I don't want to overstate where we are in the process. But what I can tell you is that what you have here matches physical and behavioral characteristics consistent with a pre-commercial heritage line that my department has been trying to locate documented examples of for 6 years." She looked up. "We thought this line was effectively extinct." Clara looked at the herd, grazing in the long afternoon shadow. 13 animals now. The third calf had come 2 weeks ago, quiet and clean and upright within the hour. "What does it mean?" Clara said. "Practically, what does it change?" Dr. Park clicked her pen. "It means that if we can complete a formal assessment, you have grounds to pursue heritage breed protected status, which means several things. Some of them good for you, some of them complicated." "Tell me the complicated ones first," Clara said. Dr. Park looked at her with the expression of someone who has just gained a measure of respect for a person. "Protected status means the breed becomes a matter of public record. People will know these animals exist. That brings attention, research interest, conservation funding, genuine support from people who care about breed preservation." She paused. "But it also brings commercial interest, collectors, breeders looking for something novel, operators who want to crossbreed for hardiness traits, and it makes them visible to anyone who's been looking for them. Including people who would rather control them than protect them," Clara said. "Yes," Dr. Park said, "including those." Clara looked out at the valley, at the cracked clay and the dry grass, and the distant line of hills that had been the edge of her world for 8 months now. "How long does the assessment take?" she said. 3 months minimum," Dr. Park said. 6 is more realistic." "And during that time?" "During that time, legally, your situation doesn't change. You own the animals, but you should know that the moment I file the initial assessment report, it becomes a document of public record." She set her notebook on her knee. "Some people have been known to make moves before that documentation is complete, to acquire or otherwise compromise the animals in question before protected status can be established." Clara heard it clearly. "You're warning me." "I'm informing you," Dr. Park said carefully. "What you do with the information is your decision." Clara got down from the tailgate. She stood with both hands in her jacket pockets, looking at her herd. 13 animals, all of them moving slowly, purposefully, eating things nothing else would eat, and finding water in places nothing else looked, and asking nothing of her except to be let alone to be what they were. She thought about Crowley and his 42 animals and his patient, organized mind. She thought about Dennis at the extension office with his binders and his doubt. She thought about Bob Henderson at his fence, and Ray Hayes with his hat, and Thomas Gable at her kitchen table saying, "I was wrong," with every muscle in his face resisting the words. She thought about Martin, 81 years old, pulling a ledger from the bottom of a stack because someone had finally asked. "File the assessment," she said. Dr. Park looked at her. "You understand the risk." "I understand the risk of not filing it too," Clara said. "File it." Dr. Park wrote something in her notebook. Then she clicked the pen closed and looked up at the herd. "They really are something," she said. "It came out simply, without performance, the way people say true things when they forget to be professional." "I know," Clara said. "I'm still figuring out how something." The sun was going low over the western ridge, and the herd moved in the long shadows, and Clara stood at the edge of her own land and felt the weight of what was coming without knowing its shape, which was not a comfortable feeling and which she had learned over 8 months in Boneyard Valley to treat not as a warning, but as information. Something was going to happen. She just needed to be standing when it did. Dr. Park filed the preliminary assessment report on a Friday morning, and by Monday, Clara's phone was ringing. Not Crowley. Not yet. The first calls were from people she didn't know. A woman from a heritage breed conservancy in Colorado, who spoke very fast and asked questions Clara didn't have answers to yet. A professor from a land-grant university 3 states away, who was careful and methodical and wanted to schedule a site visit. A journalist from an agricultural trade publication, who said he'd seen the public filing and wanted to do a story. Clara said yes to the professor, maybe to the conservancy woman, and nothing at all to the journalist, which she did by simply not calling him back and waiting to see if that was sufficient. It was. She told Elliot about the calls that Saturday when he came by, and he listened with the serious, processing expression she had come to rely on as a kind of measuring stick. If something surprised Elliot, it was genuinely surprising, and if he took it calmly, it was probably manageable. He took it calmly. "The university professor," he said. "What does he want specifically?" "To verify Dr. Park's assessment, to document the physical characteristics formally. He used the phrase baseline genetic sample, which I think means a blood draw." Elliot considered this. "The cattle won't like that." "No," Clara agreed. "But number 4 submitted to Dr. Reeves without much drama. I think they tolerate things they've decided aren't a threat." "How do they decide?" Elliot said. "I'm not entirely sure," Clara said, "but I think it has something to do with whether the person is calm." Elliot looked at the herd in the middle distance. "So the professor has to be calm." "The professor has to be calm," Clara confirmed. "Mchiao." Crowley called on Wednesday. She had been expecting it and had decided before she picked up that she would listen more than she spoke, which went against her instincts but seemed like the right strategy. His voice on the phone was exactly what it was in person. Measured, unhurried, a voice that had learned to carry patience like a tool. "I saw the filing," he said. "I assumed you would," she said. "Heritage breed assessment. That's a significant step." "It's the beginning of a process," she said. "A long one." Still, a pause. "I want to make you an offer, Clara. A real one, not the numbers we've been discussing. I've done more research on what you have out there, and I want to be straight with you about what I'm prepared to pay." She waited. 90,000, he said, "for the herd and the land, full acquisition." The number sat in the silence between them. 90,000 was not the number she had started with. 90,000 was a different conversation entirely. She was aware of that, and she was also aware that he knew she was aware of it, and that this was exactly the dynamic he was counting on. The moment when the number becomes real enough that the person on the other end has to recalibrate in real time. She did not recalibrate in real time. She had been doing it for weeks. "No," she said. A beat. "That number is, Clara, that's a fair market offer given the uncertainty of protected status. If the assessment comes back incomplete or the petition fails, those animals are significantly less valuable, and you know it." "I know," she said. "No." Another pause. Longer this time. She could hear him thinking, which was unusual. He was careful enough normally that you couldn't hear the machinery. "What would change your answer?" he said. "Nothing right now," she said. "I'm not selling. That's not a negotiating position. It's where I am." He was quiet for 3 full seconds. "The property tax reassessment is going to come through next month," he said. "The new valuation is going to be substantially higher than the current one. I want you to know that before it arrives so it doesn't catch you off guard." She breathed through her nose. "I appreciate the warning." "It's not a warning," he said. "It's information. Like you said to me." She almost smiled at that. Almost. "Goodbye, Mr. Crowley." She hung up and sat at the kitchen table for a while. $90,000. She turned it over in her mind, not because she was tempted, she wasn't, not exactly, but because she needed to understand what it meant that he'd offered it. When a man like Crowley triples his number, it means his understanding of the value has changed dramatically, and that means something has shifted in what he knows. She called Dr. Park. "The assessment," Clara said when the researcher picked up. "Has anything come back yet from the initial samples?" "Some preliminary results, yes," Dr. Park said. She sounded slightly cautious, the way scientists sound when they have information they haven't fully verified. "The DNA panel is showing distinct markers that differentiate this line from any currently registered breed. We're still waiting on the full comparison analysis, but the early indicators are..." She paused. "They're significant, Clara, more significant than I expected when I filed the initial report." "Someone talked," Clara said. Not angry, just recognizing the shape of things. "Scientific communities are small," Dr. Park said quietly. "I'm sorry. I didn't anticipate it moving this fast." It's all right, Clara said. What does significant mean? It means the genetic markers suggest traits that, if they breed true, and from what I've observed, they do, have potential applications beyond heritage conservation. Drought resistance, feed efficiency, low input viability. These are things that commercial livestock operations have been trying to engineer through selective breeding for decades. Another pause. You have something that already does it naturally. That's not a small thing, Clara. That's potentially a very large thing. Clara looked out the window at the valley, at the pale, cracked land and the brown hills and the herd moving slowly across the hillside. How large? She said. Large enough, Dr. Park said carefully, that you should probably talk to a lawyer before anyone else calls you. What? The lawyer's name was Patricia Okafor, referred by the university professor, who it turned out had been through a similar situation with a seed variety 15 years ago and had opinions about intellectual property in agricultural contexts that he delivered with the evangelical energy of someone who had learned things the hard way. Patricia Okafor drove out from the city on a Thursday and sat at Clara's kitchen table with a yellow legal pad and listened without expression while Clara laid out the full situation, the assessment, the genetics, Crowley's offer, the tax reassessment, the insurance documentation she'd collected from Thomas Gable and 3 other ranchers. When Clara finished, Okafor looked at her legal pad for a moment. The insurance documentation, she said. How complete is it? I have signed statements from 4 ranchers, policy numbers, dates, the specific exclusion language, and a signed account from Thomas Gable of the introduction Crowley facilitated. Okafor wrote something. That's not nothing. I didn't think so. It doesn't rise to a fraud claim on its own, Okafor said. He didn't write the policies and he didn't force anyone to sign, but combined with the property tax request, she wrote something else. There's a pattern of behavior that, if documented carefully and presented to the right people, creates a picture. What kind of picture? Okafor set her pen down. The kind that makes a county assessor nervous about having his name attached to an expedited reassessment request filed by a private party with a documented interest in the outcome. She looked at Clara steadily. The reassessment request is the mistake. It's the one place where his fingerprints are actually on a government document. Clara thought about what Martin had said. He doesn't leave loose ends. He didn't think I'd be in a position to push back on it, Clara said. Probably not, Okafor agreed. Most people aren't. She picked up her pen again. Now, the genetics and the breed assessment. Tell me what you want to happen with the animals long term. And I mean what you actually want, not what sounds reasonable. Clara looked at the legal pad, at the neat notes Okafor had made, at the window beyond where the valley sat in its drought-pale stillness. I want the families in this valley to have access to this breed, she said. Not just me. The people who've been here, who've been working this land, who stuck it out through the drought. I want them to be able to rebuild with something that works on this land. She paused. I don't want to patent them. I don't want to be the sole owner of the only line. That's not what this was ever about. Okafor studied her. You understand that position has financial implications. I know what it costs, Clara said. I've been doing that math for a while. And you're still Yes, Clara said. I'm still. Okafor nodded once and wrote something longer this time. The property tax reassessment came through in October, as Crowley had said it would. The new valuation was 240% of the previous number. Clara's estimated tax increase would have made the ranch effectively unsustainable within 18 months. She and Okafor had been ready for it for 3 weeks. They filed a formal challenge with the county assessor's office the same day the notice arrived, attaching the documentation of Crowley's request, a detailed history of the land's actual use and productivity over the preceding year, and a letter from Dr. Park's department at the university noting the ongoing heritage assessment and the scientific significance of the property's current operation. They also sent a copy of everything to the regional agricultural news desk, because Okafor had said, with the flat practicality of someone who understands how systems work, that sunlight is frequently more effective than legal arguments. It took 11 days. The assessor's office quietly withdrew the reassessment request and restored the previous valuation, citing administrative review. No other explanation was given. Crowley's name did not appear in any of the official communications, but Patricia at the feed store, who tracked information the way water finds the lowest point, told Clara 2 days later that there had been a tense meeting at the county building that several people had witnessed without being meant to. Clara thanked her and bought her usual supplies and drove home. Martin heard about the reassessment withdrawal before she told him. He had his own network, slower than the feed store but no less comprehensive. And when she came to visit on a Saturday afternoon, he was sitting on his porch in the thin October sun with a look on his face that she had come to identify as his version of pleased. He blinked, Martin said. He recalculated, Clara said, sitting in the chair next to him. Those aren't the same thing. Martin tilted his head. Fair. He'll try something else, she said. I'm not declaring victory. No, Martin agreed. But you've changed the math. He can't move quietly anymore. Whatever he does now, people are paying attention. He looked out at his own dry land, the brown pasture, the empty creek bed visible from the porch. In 18 years, I have never seen anyone make Crowley file a retreat, even a quiet one. Clara looked at the same landscape. Martin. When the drought breaks, and it will break eventually, what happens to the land he's been acquiring? Martin was quiet for a moment. It becomes valuable again, which is the point. But he's got to maintain it through the drought. He's got to feed 42 ridgebacks he bought at the auction. Martin turned to look at her. He bought 42 of a breed he doesn't know how to manage, Clara said. He acquired them because he recognized their value, but he doesn't know what they need the way I do. He doesn't have 7 months of observation. He doesn't have Martin Sorensen's ledger. Martin's expression shifted slowly. He's going to have losses, he said. He might, Clara said, or he might figure it out. He's not stupid. She paused. But he's going to have to ask someone for help. And the only people who know how to manage this breed correctly are me and Gable, who bought from me, and the Hayes Ranch, where Elliot has been paying attention for 9 months. Martin looked at her for a long time. You planned this. I thought about it, she said. I didn't plan it. Planning implies more certainty than I had. But you understood that selling to Gable wasn't just about Gable. I understood that every person in this valley who has a ridgeback pair owes their future partly to this herd, Clara said. And that makes us connected in a way that's harder to dismantle than a single ownership. It's not just me he'd have to acquire. It's a network. Martin leaned back in his chair. He looked at her the way he looked at things in his ledger, with the particular attention of someone who has seen a thing clearly for the first time, even though it was there all along. Harold would have liked you, he said. It was the simplest thing he had ever said to her, and it hit her somewhere she hadn't been expecting. I hope so, she said, and meant it. But Crowley came to her one more time, not in his good truck, not with a clipboard or a buyer from Denver. He came on a Tuesday morning in November when the first real cold had moved through and left frost on the ground that hadn't melted by 9 o'clock. And he came alone and knocked on the door properly and waited. She opened it. He looked different. She noticed it immediately and spent a fraction of a second trying to identify what had changed before she understood. He looked tired. Not old, not broken, just the specific tiredness of a person who has been operating at a high level of sustained effort and has reached the point where they stop hiding it. Can I come in? He said. She stepped back. He sat at the kitchen table, the same chair Gable had sat in, the same one Ray Hayes had sat in, and she put coffee in front of him without asking and sat across from him and waited. I've got a problem with the 42 head, he said. 2 of them went down last week. Not from the drought specifically. I think it's management error. I've had my people doing what they do with standard cattle, and it's not, they don't respond the same way. Clara looked at her coffee cup. I'm not here to offer you anything, Crowley said, and the directness of it was surprising enough that she looked up. I'm not trying to buy anything or sell anything. He stopped. Started again in the careful way of a man who doesn't practice asking for things, and therefore does it badly. I want to know if you'd be willing to tell me what I'm doing wrong. The kitchen was quiet. Outside, the frost was finally starting to thin in the morning sun. The herd was moving. She could see the edge of them through the window, the slow, reliable progress of animals that knew exactly where they were going. Clara thought about everything. About the gate he'd shoved open with his boot, about the word sweetheart, about the insurance policies and the tax reassessment and 18 years of patient accumulation at other people's expense. She also thought about 42 animals that hadn't chosen any of this and that were in trouble through no fault of their own. She thought about what kind of person she was, or wanted to be, and whether those were the same thing or whether they had to be worked toward. They need to find their own water, she said. If you're routing them to a trough, they're not learning the land. Let them range. Follow them in the early morning and map where they go. Stop supplementing the feed. They'll eat what's there, and what's there is enough for them even when it looks like nothing. Crowley was very still. They're not sick, she said. They're confused. They're being managed like they're something they're not. She paused. Stop trying to control their inputs and pay attention to what they do on their own. Write it down, every morning. He nodded slowly. That's it? That's the beginning of it, she said. The rest takes time. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said something she had not expected him to say. I've been doing this a long time, and I am good at what I do, but I think I misread you from the beginning. You misread the cattle from the beginning, Clara said. Me, you just underestimated. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Something more complicated and more honest than a smile. Yes, he said. I did. He stood up and picked up his hat from the table. The tax reassessment, he said without looking at her. Withdrawn, she said. I know. I want you to know that was a tactical decision that I wouldn't make again. Not because it failed, but because he stopped. It was a bad move. Clara looked at him steadily. I know what it was, she said. He nodded once, went to the door, stopped with his hand on the frame. The genetic assessment, he said. When it's complete and you have protected status, what are you planning to do with it? Make the breed available to ranching families in this region, she said, on terms they can actually meet. He turned and looked at her fully. That's going to cost you significant commercial value. I know what it costs, she said. This was becoming something she said a lot, she noticed. Crowley looked at her for a long moment. Whatever he was thinking, he kept it where she couldn't see it. Then he walked out and she heard the truck start, and she stood at the kitchen window and watched it go down the road until the dust settled. See, the rains came in December. Not dramatically, not the cinematic downpour she might have imagined a year ago, but a steady, real, week-long rain that moved in from the northwest and settled over the valley like something that had been planning to arrive for a while and had finally found the time. Clara stood on her porch on the third morning of rain and listened to the sound of water moving in the creek bed for the first time since she'd arrived. It was thin and brown and full of sediment and entirely the most satisfying sound she had heard in a year. Elliot showed up that afternoon, soaking wet because he'd bicycled over and apparently not thought about the rain as a reason to reconsider. And she handed him a towel at the door, and he dried his face and stood there dripping on her floor with an expression of pure, uncomplicated satisfaction. It's raining, he said. I noticed, she said. My dad's out walking the east pasture, Elliot said. Just walking it, not doing anything, just looking at the water coming in. He paused. I think he might be okay. Clara looked at the boy, 13 now, taller than he'd been in spring, carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who has been trusted with real work and has done it. I think so too, she said. He came in and she made cocoa because it was December and it was raining and he was 13 and she was allowing herself the small domestic fact of that. They sat at the kitchen table and listened to the rain on the roof while the cattle did what they always did, which was move at their unhurried pace across the wet ground, utterly unbothered, finding the water that was now coming freely in a land where they had learned to find it when it barely existed. 15 now, Elliot said. 15, Clara agreed. The fourth and fifth calves had come in November, both healthy. You're going to need more pasture, he said. I'm working on it. The Henderson land, Bob and I have been talking, she said. He's not selling. He's considering a grazing lease for part of the east pasture. We're still working through the details. Elliot wrapped both hands around his mug. That's smart. It was his idea, Clara said. I just said yes. Elliot looked at her across the table. Can I ask you something? You're going to anyway, she said. The corner of his mouth moved. Why didn't you take Crowley's money? The $90,000. That would have been enough to go somewhere else and start something easier. Clara thought about how to answer that honestly, without the kind of language that turns a real answer into a speech. Because easier isn't the same as better, she said. And because what's out there in that pasture is worth more than what I would have taken for it. Not in money. She paused. Because I had come far enough to see what it was, and walking away from something you can finally see clearly is harder than walking away before you understood it. She looked out the window at the rain. And because your grandfather said something to me the first time I met him, and I've been thinking about it ever since. Elliot waited. He said the old ways of the land still hold wisdom that modern ranchers have forgotten, she said. I didn't know what he meant that day. I thought I did, but I was only understanding the surface of it. She looked at her hands around the mug. It's not just about cattle. It's about paying attention, about taking the long view on something that the world has decided isn't worth the patience. She stopped. I'm probably not saying it right. You're saying it fine, Elliot said. The heritage breed assessment was finalized in the following February. The designation was official, the genetic documentation was complete, and the breed was entered into the National Registry under a name Clara had chosen from Martin's ledger, the same word the old Vaquero family had used, as nearly as anyone could reconstruct the original spelling. Espina del Lomo, ridge of the spine. The university paper ran a piece. The agricultural trade publication ran a longer one, which Clara had agreed to this time because Okafor had advised that a public record of the story was its own form of protection. Dr. Park was quoted extensively. Dennis from the Extension Office was also quoted, in a paragraph that managed to suggest he had been supportive throughout the process, which Clara read twice and decided was funny enough to be its own reward. Martin Sorensen read both articles at his kitchen table and cried, which Elliot had predicted and Elliot had been right about, and which Clara, on her third cup of tea at that same table, did not mention because it seemed like the wrong moment for acknowledgement. She sold breeding pairs to 4 ranching families in the spring. Fair prices, payment terms that people could actually meet, written agreements about management practices that she and Dr. Park had developed together over winter. She sold to the Hendersons and to the Nguyens and to a young couple 3 valleys over who had come to her through the university connection and who had the kind of earnest, overwhelming eagerness that she recognized as her own from a year ago and found she had more patience for than she expected. She did not sell to Crowley directly, but she sent him, through Okafor, a copy of the management guidelines she'd developed, because 42 animals in his care that died were not a victory for anyone, and because she had decided, somewhere in the long winter, that she was not in the business of holding grudges as a strategy. Holding grudges takes energy that costs more than it returns, and she had better uses for it. Whether he followed the guidelines, she didn't know for certain. Patricia at the feed store reported that his 42 head had stabilized by January, which was information Clara took as sufficient without needing details. Now, one morning in late March, when the valley was finally green again, in the unsteady, tentative way of land that has been through something hard and is coming back on its own terms, Clara walked the full perimeter of her property for the first time since winter. All 160 acres. She hadn't done it as a single walk since the early months. There had always been something more urgent, always a reason to stay close to the herd or the cisterns or the telephone. She walked it alone, in the early morning, in the cold that was starting to soften at its edges. She walked the fence lines she had repaired with techniques she'd learned wrong and then right. She walked past the 2 secondary seeps she'd found by following cattle in the dark. She walked past the cistern she'd built badly the first time and better the second. She walked past the old spring, which was running again. Thin, still tentative, but running. She stood at the north fence line, where the valley opened up and she could see the full spread of the boneyard from the high point. The dry ridges, the greening valley floor, the creek line threading down from the hills, the rooftops of ranches she now knew by name and by family, by the particular problems they'd been through and what they'd done with them. She thought about the woman who had driven down this road in a truck with one bag and a deed she'd read 3 times before she believed it. She thought about how that woman had stood at a fence and looked at 9 shaggy, undersized animals and had no idea at all what she was looking at. That was the real thing. Not that she had saved the cattle or held off Crowley or built the cisterns or made the right deals. Those were all real, but they weren't the center of it. The center of it was that she had learned to look at something the world had written off and see it clearly, without the distortion of other people's certainty that it had no value. That was harder than it sounded. Most people can't do it. The world is very convincing when it decides something is worthless. She had not been certain. She had been stubborn and curious and occasionally terrified, and she had kept looking anyway. That was all it was, in the end. That was the whole thing. She turned and walked back down the hill, and the herd was moving on the south pasture below her. 15 animals, strong and deliberate and entirely themselves. And she could see Elliot at the far fence line, working on something, the familiar posture of a kid who has decided a place is worth showing up for. She raised a hand. He raised one back without looking up, which meant he'd heard her footsteps, which meant he was paying attention to the same land she had finally learned to pay attention to. She walked down to meet him. Behind her, the valley spread out in the pale morning light, old and scarred and alive, and the creek ran thin and real over the same stones it had run over before anyone now living had a name for any of this, and the wind moved through the grass the way it does when there is finally, after a long and difficult absence, enough grass for the wind to move through.